I remember the rumours. Back in the late 90s, the playground talk was all about a port of the original Resident Evil coming to the Game Boy Color. We even saw the screenshots in magazines, blurry, pixelated versions of the Spencer Mansion that looked like they were being viewed through a screen door. But even as a kid, I wasn't buying into the hype. By the time the Game Boy Color was trying to find its footing, I had already been spoiled by the high-tech wizardry of the PlayStation and Dreamcast. To me, the Game Boy didn't feel like a miracle of miniaturization. It just looked kinda crappy. I was never really a portable kid. The whole selling point of being able to take your games on the go never managed to hook me. To me, portable meant unplugging the console, gathering up all the tangled mess of controls and power bricks, and lugging the whole setup over to a mate's house or my nan's. I was perfectly happy sitting on the carpet, 2 feet away from the TV, tethered to a machine that actually had the power to make me feel something. The idea of squinting at a tiny, unlit 160 by 144 pixel screen while sitting in the back of the car just didn't appeal to me. Mostly because those car rides usually ended in a wave of motion sickness if I tried to focus on anything smaller than the horizon. So when Resident Evil Gaiden finally arrived in 2001, I gave it a wide berth. I couldn't understand why anyone would want to trade in the cinematic horror and atmosphere tension of the home consoles for the top-down sprite fest on a handheld that felt like a generation behind the curve. Even the Super Nintendo from years earlier felt more exciting to me than what the Game Boy was offering at the turn of the millennium. It's taken me 25 years to finally circle back and see what I missed. I'm playing this entirely for the sake of this history, stepping into a pocket-sized nightmare that I spent over 2 decades successfully avoiding. The existence of Gaiden is actually tied to one of the most famous what-ifs in handheld history. Before this game was even a thought, Capcom had a team working on a direct port of the original 1996 Resident Evil for the Game Boy Color. It was a technical madness. They were trying to squeeze pre-rendered backgrounds and FMV sequences onto a cartridge that had less processing power than a modern toaster. They actually got quite far with it, and those screenshots I mentioned earlier were from a build that was nearly finished before Capcom pulled the plug. They realised that the experience was just too compromised. It wasn't the premium feeling they wanted for their flagship series, but they didn't want to waste their effort on the market opportunity, so Gaiden was born as the consolation prize. Instead of trying to recreate a 3D masterpiece on 2D hardware, they outsourced the project to a British developer called M4 Limited and told them to build something original. This wasn't going to be the Spencer Mansion, it was going to be its own beast, designed specifically for the limitations of the Game Boy. In a way, this was a much smarter move, but it also meant that Gaiden became this weird outlier in the series. It was the game that stepped in because the real port couldn't handle the pressure. It felt like a compromise from the very start, a way to satisfy the handheld audience with a story that felt disconnected from the main survival horror line. For someone like me, who was already skeptical of the hardware, knowing this was essentially the plan B didn't exactly help the case. It felt like a game made of leftovers, and that feeling of it being a side project is something that has followed its reputation for a quarter of a century. The task of shrinking a title like Resident Evil fell to a British studio called M4 Limited. If you were a handheld gamer in the early 2000s, you probably ran into their work without even realising it. They were the hired guns for taking big licenses and making them work on tiny screens. But even for a team used to the constraints of the Game Boy, Resident Evil was a massive mountain to climb. How do you take a series defined by its fixed camera angles, high fidelity sound, and tank controls, and make it feel like anything other than a disaster on a device with 2 buttons? M4's solution was to completely pivot the perspective. They moved away from the 3D aspirations of the cancelled RE1 port and leaned into a top-down, bird's-eye view for exploration. It was a pragmatic choice, but it stripped away the one thing that made the series famous: the cinematic dread. When you see the whole room from above, the jump scares lose the teeth. You aren't worried about what's lurking behind the corner, because you can see the corner, the zombies and the exit all at once. There's a strange irony in a British dev team taking the reins of such a Japanese-coded franchise. They tried to keep the flavour, the green herbs, the keys with suit symbols, the inventory management, but the soul of the development was purely about technical problem solving. They were trying to build a survival horror engine on a platform that was fundamentally allergic to the genre. It's an impressive feat of coding certainly, but looking at it through the lens of a kid who wanted the real experience, it felt like a translation that lost the most important part of the original text. Booting up Resident Evil Gaiden for the first time in 2026 is a surreal experience. After 25 years of actively dodging this thing, finally seeing that Capcom logo pop up on a tiny simulated Game Boy Color screen felt like meeting a pen pal I'd spent 2 decades ghosting. I'll be honest, my childhood skepticism hasn't softened much with age. Looking at these chunky sprites and garnished colour palette on the Game Boy Color, I could feel that old carpet-based car ride internal debate starting all over again. Even through a modern lens, the limitations are staggering. You're navigating Leon S. Kennedy and Barry Burton, 2 of the biggest legends in the series, but they're reduced to tiny little clusters of pixels that look more like they belong in a lost Pokemon hack than a horror masterpiece. There's a total lack of atmosphere I've spent the last few weeks soaking in while playing the PS1 and Dreamcast titles. Where those games use sound and shadow to make my skin crawl, Gaiden uses a bleepy, bloopy soundtrack that sounds like a microwave having a midlife crisis, but there's a weird, morbid curiosity that kept me playing. Because I have zero nostalgia for this, I'm seeing it for exactly what it is: a brave, slightly delusional attempt to do the impossible. It doesn't feel like Resident Evil, but it doesn't feel like anything else on the Game Boy either. It's clunky, the movement is stiff, and the lack of backlight on the original hardware would have made this a literal headache. But as a piece of history, it's fascinating. It's the first time in the entire series' reflection that I've felt like a complete outsider looking in, trying to understand a game that I was never meant to love. The plot of Gaiden is where things go from handheld experiment to alternate universe fanfiction. We're back in the boots of Leon S. Kennedy, but he isn't the rookie cop or secret agent we know. He's an operative for an anti-Umbrella underground organisation. He gets sent to the Starlight, a luxury passenger ship, to track down a new type of organic weapon. When he goes missing, enter Barry Burton. Having Barry as a lead playable lead is a treat, especially since he was largely sidelined after the first game, but seeing him rendered in 8-bit pixels on a boat feels like a fever dream. The story revolves around a shape-shifting creature with a green blood that can mimic humans, which turns the cruise ship into a claustrophobic whodunit mystery. It's actually a decent setup for a horror game, trapped on a boat in the middle of the ocean with a monster that could be anyone. If this were a main entry with 2001 era cinematics, it probably would have been a fan favourite, but on the Game Boy Color, the narrative tension is constantly fighting against the presentation. You're told there's a terrifying parasitic threat, but you're looking at a green smudge on a purple background. The most infamous part of the plot though is the ending. Without spoiling the specifics for those who haven't seen it, it ends on a massive cliffhanger that suggests one of our heroes might not be who they seem. For years, fans debated what this meant for the timeline, until Capcom finally stepped in and effectively wiped the whole thing from existence. Gaiden isn't just a side story, it's a non-canon ghost ship. It's a story that exists in its own little bubble, and while the green blood mystery is a fun bit of trivia, it ultimately leads to a dead end that the rest of the franchise completely ignores.
No thanks, bro.
My.
If the top-down exploration didn't feel like a departure, the combat in Gaiden is where the game truly loses its mind. In every other entry, combat is about spatial awareness, knowing where the zombie is and how much room you have to back up. But here, as soon as you touch an enemy, the screen shifts into a first-person view with a sliding bar at the bottom. It's essentially a rhythm game. You have to time your button presses as the cursor slides back and forth across a meter, hit the centre, and you land a headshot. Miss, and you're just wasting precious ammo. It's one of the most bizarre design choices I've ever encountered in a horror game. I felt like I was playing a low-stakes version of golf on the NES. It completely pulls you out of the world. You aren't fighting a zombie. You're playing a minigame. It's a clever way to bypass the fact that the Game Boy couldn't handle real-time 3D combat, but it effectively turns every encounter into a math problem. There's also the frustration of the hitboxes. Depending on the weapon, that sweet spot on the meter changes size, and if the enemy moves, the target moves with it. When you're stuck on a carpet 2 feet from the TV, you want immersion. You want to feel the weight of the encounter. Gaiden gives you the swinging needle. It's a mechanical workaround that highlights exactly why my younger self was so wary of the handheld experience. It felt like a compromise that turned survival into a timing exercise. And after 25 years, I can safely say that the rhythm horror is a genre that probably didn't need to exist. When Gaiden hit shelves in late 2001, the reaction was exactly what you'd expect for a game that tried to put a square peg in a round hole. It wasn't a disaster on the level of Survivor 2, but it was met with a collective shrug from the core fanbase. Critics gave it points for effort, acknowledging that M4 Limited had pulled off a technical miracle just by getting it to run, but the fun factor was a harder sell. It was a Resident Evil game that didn't play, look, or sound like Resident Evil. For most people, it was a novelty you played for 20 minutes before going back to whatever was on your home console. The legacy of the game is even stranger than its release. Because it was a late-life Game Boy Color title, released right as the Game Boy Advance was taken over, it didn't stay on shelves for long. It became one of the hidden games that collectors obsess over, not because it was a masterpiece, but because it was an anomaly. It's the black sheep of the family, the weird cousin who showed up to the party with a different last name and started talking about green blood and rhythm-based shooting. For the community, Gaiden became a source of endless what-if lore videos. The ending was so controversial and strange that fans spent years trying to figure out if it meant Leon was actually a clone or a shapeshifter in Resident Evil 4. Eventually, Capcom had to step in and clarify that the game was non-canon, effectively turning the Starlight into a ghost ship in the franchise's history. It's a game that exists in a vacuum. It didn't influence the future of the series, and it didn't redefine handheld gaming. It just sat there as a reminder that the Resident Evil brand was big enough to experiment, even if those experiments ended in a dead end.
What a monster! I can't believe... What the hell is this place anyway?
After 25 years of avoidance, finishing Resident Evil Gaiden feels like closing a chapter of a book I never really wanted to read in the first place. I went into this wondering if my younger self had been too harsh, if I'd missed out on a secret handheld masterpiece because I was too obsessed with polygon counts and CRT scanlines. But as the credits roll on this 8-bit odyssey, I can safely say that the kid sitting on the carpet was right. Portability wasn't worth the price of admission. The technical ambience of Gaiden is undeniable, and I have a newfound respect for the developers who tried to squeeze the blood out of an 8-bit stone, but respect isn't the same thing as enjoyment. Survival horror is built on atmosphere, and atmosphere requires a level of sensory immersion that the Game Boy Color simply couldn't provide. Whether it was the all-a-dream nonsense of Survivor 2, or the rhythmic golf combat of Gaiden, 2001 was clearly a year where the franchise was struggling to find its footing outside of the main numbered entries. So, the Starlight sinks into the non-canon abyss, and I'm finally done with the diversions. I can stop squinting at the pixelated Barry Burton, and get back to what I actually love about this series. I don't regret finally playing it, it's a vital piece of the history, but I'm more than happy to leave this in the past. My motion sickness is gone, the screen is big again, and we're moving back towards the era where Resident Evil wasn't just trying to fit onto a cartridge, it was trying to redefine the entire industry.
Why don't you do us all a favor and leave before the audience gets pissed off?